Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Arden Hagley, the co-organizer of this series, Medical Humanities and Pandemic Urbanisms at the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. We're delighted to welcome you back to our series celebrating the new undergraduate major in medical humanities here at Columbia. Although we're on Zoom and meeting virtually, we remember that Columbia University resides on the Lenape-Hoking, the unceded homeland of the Lenape. Now tonight, I want to take a minute to thank Sarah Monks, who has been the absolute brains and wizard behind the scenes of this series and has been so unbelievable in facilitating all the technology for us. So thank you to Sarah. Tonight's panel is designed to be a fireside chat, and it is titled From Monomyth to Multimyth, BIPOC children's fantasists discuss globalism, possible futures, and writing in the age of pandemic. And tonight builds on the themes of our series by considering how narrative and storytelling can imagine positive futures for medicine and health, even as they address the fractures and fissures of our society, and especially the problems of racism and racial bias. Our moderator tonight is Professor Neni Panourgiá, who is an anthropologist, associate professor at the Prison Education Program Psychology Department, and academic advisor at the Justice in Education Initiative at Columbia University. She will begin by introducing our panelists. Welcome, Professor Panourgiá.
Thank you very much, Arden. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Very many thanks again to Sarah, who is as Arden said, who is the brains and the souls behind everything that happens in the medical humanities in at Columbia. I mean, this is Sarah Monks, I'm sorry. And thank you to the panelists. It's very good to see you here. To see you, Sayantani, after Sayantani and I were together in narrative medicine a few years back. So let me not take time from the speakers. And what we will do is, as Arden said, this is sort of a chat and a discussion, exchange of points of view, as the Beatles used to say, or ideas. And I will sort of intervene only if we see that, you know, there's no flow, but there will be flow. And what I will do is that I will introduce all the panelists, the three panelists together, so that I will not interrupt any flow of thought as we go on. So Sayantani Dasgupta is the New York Times bestselling author of the critically acclaimed Bengali folktale and string theory inspired Kiranmala and the Kingdom Beyond books, the first of which, The Serpent Secret, my son read at Bank Street and was a Bank Street Best Book of the Year. Yeah, there you are. Book list, Best Middle Grade Novel of the 21st Century, and an E.B. White Read Aloud Honor Book. She's also the author of She Persisted, Virginia Apgar, a part of Chelsea Clinton's She Persisted series, and the forthcoming anti-colonial Bengali folktale-inspired middle-grade fantasy Force of Fire. Sayantani is a pediatrician by training, and even if you didn't know this, Virginia Apgar would have given her away. And is senior lecturer at the graduate program in narrative medicine, the Center for Study of Ethnicity and Race, and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, all here at Columbia University. Her academic work is at the interstices of race, health, speculative fiction, and abolition. And she's the co-author or the co-editor of several academic books, including Principles and Practices of Narrative Medicine that came out in 2016 by the University of Oxford Press. She's a team member of We Need Diverse Books, and she can be found online at Sayantani Dasgupta. and on Twitter at handle Sayantani16. So this is Sayantani Dasgupta right there. And then I think David Bowles comes next. He has a piano right behind him. David Bowles is a Mexican-American author and translator from South Texas, where he teaches adolescent literature and now at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He has written more than 24 titles, most notably the multiple award-winning book, They Call Me Guero, as well as the Latinx fantasy series, Garza Twins, 13th Street, and Cloco Curandera. His work appears in many textbooks and anthologies, plus venues such as, oh, there it is, as the New York Times, the English Journal, the School Library Journal, and the Journal of Children's Literature. His research into indigenous Mesoamerican languages has led to collections of his translations such as Flower, Song, Dance, Aztec, and Maya poetry, and Feathered Serpent, Dark Heart of Sky, Myths of Mexico. David is one of the co-founders of Dignidad Literaria, a grassroots activist campaign for greater Latinx representation in publishing. In 2017, he was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters and now serves on its governing council. And not least at all, Carlos Hernandez is the author of Selling Gaby Break the Universe, which is one of the Parabel Award in 2019. Selling Gaby Fix the Universe, which comes out in paperback today. And, and the Assimilated Cuban's Guide to Quantum Santeria. Carlos received his letter confirming his appointment as full professor of English from the City University of New York about a month ago, and is still quite very much excited about it, he says. And so are we. He's also a game designer and enthusiast and is exploring the narrative possibilities of games through a number of projects. And you can find him on socials at Right Teach Play. So without further ado, I will ask Sayantani, who had the brilliant idea of sending out a bunch of questions for all of us to think about. And then David did the same, and then Carlos did the same. So let's get started with a couple of questions, and then we will just see how this goes. But before the questions, I would like to invite all three of you to just say a few words about yourselves that go beyond what I just read. So, Sayantani.
Thank you so much, Neni. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I cannot wait till we can be in physical space together as well, right? Cannot wait safely to do so safely and to be in physical space with all of you, kind of discussing ideas and thinking about all of these fascinating topics together. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you, Arden. Thank you, Rishi. Thank you, all of the organizers of this wonderful pandemic urbanism series, and congratulations on the new medical humanities major, which is very, very exciting. So as Neni said, I teach here at Columbia in 3 programs, 1 a graduate program, the narrative medicine program, and 2 undergraduate programs, or centers, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, and also an institute, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, which is actually where, of course, the medical humanities new major sits. And I always thought, even, before I started teaching here at Columbia, that my writing life and my academic/medical life, my life, which was more clinical medicine and then has over the years, over 20 years, become far more academic, were two disparate things. I, often thought that I wrote creatively and I did this other academic stuff and they didn't fit, or I had to keep one secret from the other. They were like, friends that I couldn't let meet each other. And it's only really recently that I myself, perhaps others were able to see it for me, but I myself have been able to appreciate how deeply my academic work influences my, fiction aimed at 8 to 12-year-olds. That includes a lot of, demon snot and riddles and jokes and, fart humor at times. And my deeply, far more serious scholarly work, it influences each other. There's a reason that Force of Fire is, an anti-colonial book that sneaks in all sorts of important kind of anti-colonial struggles from throughout the world. And I would say that vice versa, finding that utter joy of being a fantasist who writes for young people has been really important to my life, as a scholar. There's a reason that I teach a class called Visionary Fiction or Visionary Medicine, Race, Health, and Speculative Fiction. It's because I really, am excited about how speculation and what Walida Imarisha calls visionary fiction helps us imagine our ways into more just futures. So that's like a breath more about me. David or Carlos, do you want to?
Well, I mean, I think that I agree. My life is very similar to yours, Sayantani, although I think that I understood perhaps a little bit earlier that those things were going to be intertwined for me. I don't know whether it's just a function of being from a community of color or what it is, but kind of like early on, I realized that I wasn't born into the sort of privilege that allowed me to say, I'm going to compartmentalize this. When I do academic work, it's going to be this and nothing else from my life or my community's issues or my ancestral, the visions of my ancestors for the future of their descendants. None of that is going to impinge on the work that I do. It became evident to me as I worked towards a terminal degree that all those things are going to be interrelated, and they are. I mean, the work that I do preparing teachers as the coordinator of the English education program at the university, the work that I do as a writer of, I think, fiction, speculative fiction for young people that's rooted in Mexican American identity, the work that I do as a scholar of indigenous languages like Nahuatl as well, like all those things to me seem bound up in one another and really, really difficult to kind of tease out. So I don't even bother. And maybe it makes it kind of a little weird for some people that you're sliding back and forth in and among these different elements of your work. And they're always, communicating with one another, but I wouldn't have it any other way. And like each thing, and what ends up happening, you have all these feedback loops. So the things that you're doing academically, like enriching the work that you're doing for children and so forth. And I just think it's really fantastic. So yeah, like I throw my hat into that ring as well of like letting all of it bleed into one another. Carlos.
Yeah. I want to jump in and say that my PhD is an English creative writing PhD. Yeah, it's from Binghamton University, and so I came in with my head down, barred forward, charging in, saying I'm going to carve out a place, in this position, as a person who is, Latinx and explicitly writing about the Latinx experience. So I came in pretty bold that way. And what I would say is that, my Twitter handle is Write, Teach, Play, because like what I do is I write, I teach, and I play, and all of those things are intermingled every day. This morning, my wife and I were working on a new role-playing game that we are co-designing together. We have a meeting with our publisher tomorrow, so we're doing that crashing and banging thing that you do right before you meet with publishers about your game. But that was this morning, and then for 3 hours I was on Zoom talking to students one-on-one during my office hours about the intricacies of how the heck articles work in the English language. And by the way, let's just eliminate them. Let's just take a vote and just remove articles, because man, so that was that. And now I get to do this literary panel. And I feel like what this has allowed me to do is to exercise all these different skills that I have that in many ways might not have been allowed to be exercised unless you kind of charged in with the kind of political awareness, I think, David, that you were kind of talking about. And what I was very lucky in that, I earned my PhD before I started publishing regularly. And that gave me the sort of like political consciousness and, taking courses in feminism and then seeing the limits of feminism of the 90s versus the intersectionality that we're seeing now and watching that evolve. So being able to be a teacher really meant that I got to extend my life as a student. And I feel like that kind of interdisciplinary education that I was able to get by doing the work of a teacher and doing this game design work that I do, and constantly working and thinking about how narratives create possibilities for ourselves, those three things have created the imbrex, to use my education, that created that imbricated kind of approach to life that I think is maybe the most important thing. So I love that we're here in the medical humanities, because I just love those two words together. I learned about the medical humanities maybe only about 10 years ago. It's a relatively new thing for me, but to me, it's just, what could be more informative to medicine than the humanities? And likewise, how much richer could the humanities be with that sort of infusion of maybe the most humanities-like of the sciences? I think biology and medicine are maybe vying for the most translatable to humanities-like studies. So I think it's a perfect point of collision for really exciting innovations.
Well, I mean, just to expand on, as the medical humanities member of the three of us, and Neni as well, I think if we think about the ways that humanities helps us, expand out what counts as not just medicine, but health more broadly, we can think about, access to water, the ability, not to experience police violence. We can think about, prison abolition. We can think about, kind of environmental justice. We can think about this very broad swath of, reality making that counts as health. And I think that the humanities is what helps us do that really important expanding beyond kind of the professionalization or the technical kind of definitions of what counts as medicine, right?
And how
that's
much of
really
medicine,
exciting to me.
Yeah, how much of medicine relies on cultural understanding? I was remembering one of my professors who was working in Mexico, an anthropologist working in Mexico, basically with a medical humanities project of trying to tell doctors that when folks come in and say they have an empacho, that empacho is actually a real thing and not just some folksy thing that should be ignored. You just have indigestion. And what they needed was a translator to come in between and say, empacho is something that should be treated in the following ways and talked about in these ways and questioned in these kinds of ways. It's one of those moments where it's like the humanities training and critical reading, and the humanities training and looking at the small and expanding outward, which is somewhat opposite to the way much science works, where you're taking large data sets and drawing conclusions from them, that approach still has a use there. And at the same time, I think, things like the medical rounds that you do as doctors, I think there is no other discipline that does rounds. And I think that round is a very specific kind of pedagogy that is extremely humanistic, because you have to take the whole person and you have to translate language that is coming at you, and you have to come in with more medical expertise than the person that you're speaking to, and turn what they're saying into a medical diagnosis, which is an act of translation, which is a very humanistic kind of connection to happen. So all of those things together tell me, I just love the medical humanities. I think it's a beautiful intersection.
Oh, and before we go on, I just wanted to tell our listeners that our Q&A is open. Neni, is it open? So you could always drop, if we're chatting and you have questions, we want to chat among ourselves, but we also want to chat with you. So if there are folks listening to this who have things that they want to add or questions, please do drop them in the chat or the Q&A, which is maybe the Q&A. Okay.
I think it's
Sorry,
Q&A.
But both are open. So
That's true.
So go for it. Sorry, David.
So go for it.
Yeah, no worries. I was just thinking the little anecdote that Carlos was talking about with doctors working with like more indigenously rooted people in Mexico and the quote unquote folk ailments that they might have, which are themselves rooted in hundreds and hundreds of years of indigenous understanding of health and so forth. And that's a really, really fantastic story. And I think it ties into the notion of futurism, especially the way I conceive of futurism, which is as much about the past and the present as it is about the future, right? And about finding that thread that connects those for a particular community. And now what the word for that thread is mecatl. Mecatl is where we get the Mexican Spanish word mecate, which means rope. So yeah, it can definitely mean rope or string, but it also means lineage, and just like this notion that there's a connectedness of understanding from the past, present, that we want to project into the future, and that dreamed of future that we have. I think also applies to those to medical practices and to this notion of the rounds that Carlos was getting into, and the kind of storytelling that is diagnosis, right? Trying to understand people, translate, and tell a story that's comprehensible to the patient, to the family of the patient, and that fits in with their worldview and their understanding of the human body, as well as being scientifically accurate and so forth. And so I also love this conversation because the way that these things are bound up for me and my understanding. I just think it's this really, really fantastic that we're having the conversation.
Yeah, that's exactly the work of narrative medicine. A lot of that work, Neni.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to put up a little shim here and ask about what you call fantasist writing, which is what all three of you do, which I understand as creating worlds that might exist somewhere but are not necessarily part of the immediate tangible experience of children. And I want to, because you all, and rightly so, frame this through the question of coloniality and post-coloniality, anti-colonial struggles. So I want to really, this is provocative, I know, I understand, but I want us to go back and think about the fact that Plato had said that folk tales and other sorts of tales should not be taught to children, right? As Carlos said, this is a pedagogical endeavor. This is pedagogical labor, which it is. So folk tales should not be taught to children because they actually upset their very fragile psychic constitution. So I just want to put this out there to you, and I want to hear how you think of this.
Yeah, Plato also kicked the poets out of Utopia, so
exactly.
we can take Plato with and then he invited them back in as their propagandists. He's like, if you write propaganda for Utopia, then we'll let you. Plato we can take with a pound of salt.
He's a proto-fascist. not.
But that's what I'm saying. But that's what I'm asking. I mean, that's precisely what I'm asking.
Well, as a game-based student, like one of the quotes that we often use in game-based learning is that Plato also said that those who will be trained to be kings should be engaged in play as part of their education, because play is a thing that reveals more knowledge more quickly than anything, and kings have to learn fast. So I think, Plato, he had his messages mixed, because what fantasy is a sort of, it's a way of describing the world as you either wish it was or you wish it wasn't. It is basically, it's not always wish fulfillment as sometimes people think. I think it's also sort of like, a wish against. And I think that's where the post-colonial mind often goes. So, in Salangabby, I've created a magnet art school called Kuleko that is this impossibly gorgeous school full of all of these extremely committed teachers, and everybody is ready to perform at a drop, and it's immensely talented, and it's a fantasy because Cubans need fantasies. We also need to be able to envision worlds and where these heights can be achieved as well. And one of the things that I remember in preparing for Salangabby that I was saying to myself is, I want to make sure that people see positive portrayals of education in relation to the Cuban American experience, because so much of middle grade is devoted to terrible principals and abusive teachers, and we're just going to turn them into the evil jokes, the butt of jokes, or just plain evil people who do evil things to children. And I think that doesn't offer us the full spectrum of what might be possible. And if you put that only in front, then we are limiting scope. We are limiting vision. And I think for me, what middle grade can do exceptionally well right now, because we are in a middle grade renaissance right now. There are so many glorious books being written, and the ones that, my panelists here are two among a wide bevy of great writers. We're in a renaissance partially because it is so diverse and people are so engaged in portraying the joy and possibility and wonder that come from these backgrounds and are being exploded out into the current world.
But I'll tell you, Carlos, that that's relatively recent, right? I don't know how long you would say that we've been in kind of a middle grade fantasy renaissance. Not very long.
Not long.
Because
a decade.
Right? This book, A Serpent Secret, came out in 2018 when I tried to sell it for 10 years before that almost. Right? 10 years almost before that. And the reason I had trouble selling it was as follows. This is a story about a immigrant daughter, or a daughter who thinks she's simply like a human immigrant daughter, who ends up being a intergalactic immigrant daughter from a different dimension. So, she thinks she's just a regular Indian immigrant daughter from New Jersey. Turns out she's this intergalactic actual princess who has to go across the galaxies, follow the stories of her parents almost like a roadmap, as I myself, as an immigrant daughter to this country, had to follow the stories of my grandmother almost like a roadmap to see people like me in stories. Because when I was growing up here, I never got to see anybody like me in a story as a protagonist. But she goes off, she has adventures. It's a story about a brown girl being joyous, trying to find her beloved and loving parents. And really in the process discovering the truth about herself. And the response I would get, let's say 10-ish years ago, as I was trying to publish this book, was as follows. Oh, it's an immigrant daughter story. We love your voice, but what we'd prefer is a realistic fiction story that captures the oppressive nature of South Asian parents. So please, write a realistic fiction story about how terribly oppressed, preferably gender oppressed, right, this immigrant daughter is, and how sad she is, and how she overcomes that sadness by, rejecting her background. Yes, and I was like, I'm not writing this voyeuristic, ridiculous book. I'm not interested in A, serving up pain. B, I don't have that particular pain to serve up. I have beloved, progressive, political parents, and I would like to celebrate them. And there was really no room for an immigrant daughter or a brown-skinned adventure story. There just wasn't. And there's been a shift, and I feel like the shift happened prior to the pandemic, but in this moment of the pandemic, as we're thinking, like in this pandemic urbanism series, about what we're going to bring through the portal and the world that we're going to create on the other side, right? Arundhati Roy calls the portal a pandemic. I really feel like we as folks of color, as, fantasists, anti-colonial or, decolonial fantasists, for lack of a better word, have a really important job and an important opportunity to help us all imagine like what we take through the portal. What do you think?
I agree. With Goddess of Twins, I went through something very similar. It was that first book, The Smoking Mirror, which went on to get the Bird of the Prey author honor, was rejected like dozens of times. Like people saying very similar things, and also that the names of Aztec and Mayan gods are too hard, and there's no white character. Can't we have a white sidekick so that like they can
best friend?
Yeah, the white best that can like go on the journey of like understanding. No, I'm not going to center whiteness so that you can sell more copies. But I kind of want to go back to the root of this, which is the question about folklore. And for me, folklore, and I started before I published Goddess of Twins. I was doing stuff in folklore and have several books like from university presses retelling folk tales and so forth. To me, folklore, what it does, and when we think about it in this, in the anti-colonial kind of perspective, is it encodes certain truths about the world that the community would otherwise not have access to because they're erased from the narrative that the hegemonic culture is teaching in schools that kind of like undercuts the reality that the community of color is living. And so when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I'm 51, the stories that my grandmother Garza and my uncles and aunts would tell me, and one of the interesting things about Spanish is that historia means both story and history, right? So they were often just like scary stories, and then sometimes they were stories of like the Texas Rangers hanging Mexican Americans in the year 1915. And to me, going to school, I was like, that can't possibly be true. Texas Rangers, they're like the heroes. And my grandfather would be like, no, pinches rinches, the stupid, Texas Rangers. As I grew older, I realized that things were being preserved, that truths about our history are being preserved, and truths about the world as it is are being preserved. Like, and I explore this a little bit, and they call me Güero, when Güero's reflecting on the stories that he's been told, and he remembers, which is semi-autobiographical, the very first lullaby he's ever sung by his grandmother, which is "Duérmete mi niño, duérmete ya, porque viene cucu y te comerá." Right? Go to sleep now, because if you don't, the boogeyman's going to come and eat you. And it's an outsider might go, "What a terrifying thing to sing to a baby," but what it realizes in thinking about it is that it is a warning. It is like, there are dangers in this world, but if you listen to family lore, we can keep you safe. We know the rules of this world that we have to suffer through and live in, right? And so to me, folklore is all about that. And obviously a proto-fascist like Plato is going to want to eliminate that, because it's an anti-colonial and anti-hegemony kind of narrative. It's all about, the real monsters in the world are the people who are oppressing us, and here are the secret ways to get around that oppression and to still celebrate life and be happy and healthy, despite the fact that you are going to live every day, stepping around oppression.
I know we have an audience question, but I just want to say, David, I've just never heard anybody call Plato a proto-fascist, and it's a moment of clarity in my mind that it's just like, yes, that's the thing. That's the thing I've been looking to say. It's perfect. It is chef kiss. And I just want to say also that it also fits in with the modern rebirth of with fantasy. If we think about C.S. Lewis and we think about Tolkien too, and how much how much nation building and British colonial nation building is built in their mindsets. And I think the reading that prompted some of this discussion in the first place really talks about the fact that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien both, they were colleagues. They were, talking about how to, basically use medieval scholarship and hold it up against the classics, like the Aeneid and things like that. But the Aeneid is a nation-building epic, and so many epics are there to formulate a nation. And Plato is also formulating a nation, and nations need enemies, and nations need borders. That is like one of the big roots of contemporary fantasy that still plays over and again with thoughtless or thought light recreations of a certain kind of monomyth, which is why this is called multimyth, because when you start building off of those folklores and those non-hegemonic cultures, now you start infiltrating. This is,
Yeah.
The narrative of Homi Bhabha and other theorists that you've read speak exactly to how the folklore can be used to infiltrate and to, decolonialize.
Yeah, because instead of centering nation states, it centers communities. It centers, like long heritage and ethnic identity, and that is a completely different set of things. And
Right. And complexity of identity.
Exactly, because the monomyth, although you can see monomythic kinds of things, for example, in the Popol Vuh, which is a Maya epic, or in some like Nawa stories, as when Quetzalcoatl descends into the underworld to retrieve the bones to make humanity. I mean, there are monomythic, types of things, but the monomyth, as it's used in fantasy literature, is almost always colonial. It's always about a hero going to the exotic land and taking something from the people of that land to bring back to his people that will continue to give them a leg up, in terms of political power in the world. And so disrupting that is super important.
Absolutely. So if we want to go, do we want to go to this question from the audience?
Well, we have actually two by now. So one is, how do you think books for young readers will talk about the pandemic experiences, especially in fantasy novels? This comes from Clara de Moraes Souza and from Anne CUNY, who this is in the chat. She asks, I'm interested in providing an experience that allows a child to explore their imagination. So what we expose the child to in order to open that door should include not just children's stories, but literature, art, and music that challenges them to question the world of adults. So do you think that children are prepared for that? I think the gaming world presents narrative that is often violent and gain and power are core. Is this the new law that children are learning? And where will this take their imaginations? And then someone is, and Avisha Ganguly is asking to share a reading about Tolkien.
So can I do that first?
So let's no, because Clara de Moraes Souza has been waiting very patiently to ask about, to hear about the pandemic, especially in fantasy novels, and then we can go to Tolkien, and then from Tolkien you can actually jump up to the violence and gain and power being at the core of gaming, of the gaming world.
I'd love to answer the question about pandemic and fantasy by extending the conversation that we were just having about Homi Bhabha, actually, by saying, of course, bring Homi Bhabha in. You started us with Plato, Neni. Come on, we have to bring some, some players from the other side on it.
Seriously.
I think what this pandemic has taught all of us, if we didn't know it before, is that borders are violent and meaningless, right? And so I think if, right now in India, the COVID spike there is decimating the healthcare system. And I have many family members caught up in this. As a diasporic Indian, my consciousness is so, and I'm not going to say my own, and the consciousness of so many others like me is inextricably tied to what's happening there. And we are, as a community, as a far-reaching global community. You could almost say that we live, in like a string theory universe. That's why I brought up string theory in this book, in this series. It really feels like we're living these bizarre parallel realities where I'm living in the US, things are opening up, people are getting vaccinated, we're talking about how many people you can have to a party. And in the meantime, in my mind, right next door, in the right next part of my heart, there's something very violent and different happening in India. And I think that what any diasporic community experiencing something like the Indian diasporic community is experiencing right now, it's almost like a canary in a coal mine, or Cassandra effect, where we're crying and we're yelling and we're saying borders are meaningless. There, but for the grace of whoever you believe in, go the rest of us. And people are ignoring us. They're like, oh, you're Cassandra, you're yelling, unnecessarily, you're calling attention. Our borders will protect us, right? That is over there. That is those people over there. We people over here, we will be safe, right? And I think if anything, this airborne virus, the experience of this pandemic, I hope, has taught all of us that sort of thinking not only is cruel and violent, but it does not serve us even from a selfish standpoint, right? Even from a completely selfish standpoint, like what are we thinking? Thinking that something like that will just remain magically in this artificial borderland that was like drawn in 1947 randomly by some British Raj person as they were leaving this place that we call India. That's some kind of impermeable magical border. It's not. So I hope that what we've learned, and I hope that the ways that fantasy can address what we've learned, is to realize that these borders of nation states are not homes, but that most of us are experiencing something called unhomeliness, right? As Baba would say, and that our stories must be more powerful by virtue of the fact that we are doing something different than simply, as Carlos was saying, building and reinforcing this imagined border of our nation state. That we are, in fact, maybe exploding out borders and recognizing their meaninglessness in our fantasy work. I hope.
Yeah.
I hope.
I hope so too. And I one of the things that I hope comes out of this is like a heightened understanding that culturally specific writing of the sort that the three of us do and that many of our colleagues do, that takes the tropes of fantasy and science fiction and horror and so forth and uses them to tell specific stories about specific communities, not nations, but communities, will help readers from all communities be able to see the universally human elements within those stories. Because I'm a big believer in the idea that the universal comes from the specific, right?
Yes.
And another thing that type of narrative can countervene is, one hopes, this like super prevalent in the United States notion that it is so important to cling to power that you go ahead and dehumanize people, close your borders, hurt people, treat people from those communities that are in your country as if their ethnicity or racial identity is in and of itself contagious and will get sick or whatever. The only way to push back against that kind of racist, fascist, narrative that tries to cling to power is by bombarding children with stories that lift up the dignity of every community, the literary, medical, and cultural dignity of every community, so that there's just no way for that to happen. And right now, we have seen this renaissance that we've been talking about, but it is still a drop in the bucket of the problem that exists. School-age children of color make up 50% of the population in schools. Yet, the percentage of books written by authors from their communities overall, taken as a whole, is, less than 20%. I mean, 25% of books written for children and teens every year have protagonists from those communities, but only about half of those are actually written by authors from those communities. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of gatekeepers that stand in the way of pushing that kind of vision out for children to have. And if we're going to have anti-racist schooling, or have schooling that is about fostering respect and love for the diverse coalition of people that we have living in the borders of this nation state, if we're going to try for the first time in history to have a truly pluralistic society, which has been increasingly the goal of progressive people in this country, then we have to start with the literature that children are reading. That is the baseline. And if they're just reading these classic canonical colonial narratives and then they're also receiving from the media around them the same sorts of messages, then it's a losing battle. I mean, the souls of children are won through the books that they read.
Let me just jump in there and say, man, that is so well put. And I just want to build on that, because I think, talking about what is universal and communal and cross-cultural, I think is super important. But I also think that just widening universes is also important. That is this is part of the human experience that you might not have gotten a taste of if you didn't read this book. And that widening is at least as valuable, because I think, oh, I do that too is a beautiful way to build a bridge. But I didn't even know that was possible is mind-blowing, right? And I mean, I remember, encountering Indian mythology for the first time and thinking, this is a whole new world of God making that and mythology making that is so different and way sexier than the Christianity that I'm used to, that I have now grown as a person. I'm just saying, that was an encounter that I remember being specifically very important to me. And I was extremely interested in mythology, partially because of that. And so in my late teens and 20s, I did a big exploration of mythology and remember that fondly. So that's one thing, is that we want to widen universes, not just find the commonalities. And the other thing is, my hope, I think, for the pandemic is that we stop being so anti-intellectual. That basically what we have found is that, oh, this racism is anti-intellectual, in the same way that people have approached the problem of the pandemic in anti-intellectual kinds of ways. To me, this idea that, racism is different than the way that we think of the pandemic, I think is flatly wrong, because first of all, we can see, with the declaration of calling it the China virus and other horrible, statements like that those are clear tie-ins. But the other idea is that, racism is a kind of pseudo-intellectualism, and it puts on the airs of a kind of organizational principle that simply doesn't bear out in reality, and that we have lots of evidence against. But instead, what we do is we, have lots of parts of our society that are given credence they should not be given credence, for reasons that just don't bear out in an intellectual tradition that we already have and that we can already apply. So to me, what we need to do as writers is really think about, how do we get people to honor good evidence and ignore bad evidence? How do we get people to think about, these are the stories you should believe because they're told in a way that make them believable and full of the generous spirit and the kind of life improving kinds of ways that we want our people to be, as opposed to things that twist reality. And so it's very interesting that, and almost a contradiction, or at least also ironic, that fantasy is one of the best vehicles for arguing against these kinds of broken ideas of reality, because they are themselves fantasies. I don't know how much you've been following QAnon, but QAnon's a fantasy story, and it's a terrible one.
Yeah,
it is absolutely using the devices of games actually to get people kind of addicted to it, and the kind of reinforcement, the feedback loops that games use in order to get people to really get excited about it. But it's an utterly false premise. But the difference is this: when I write a fantasy book, I call it a book, I call it a fantasy, I call it a novel. I'm lying to you from the outset, so then we can come to truth. QAnon's doing the exact opposite, where they are presenting this as truth and utterly debasing truth in the meantime so as to swindle and fool and mislead.
Do you want to go on, Carlos, and talk about gaming, or do you want us to go back, Neni, and answer the question, the kind of Tolkien article that we were referring to before? What do you think is best?
Well, Carlos sent a link on Tolkien.
The one you sent.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, here I can just pull the quick quote from it. So,
yeah, but I think that the question is an important one, especially the way that Carlos segued into it. I mean, QAnon. I would like to add onto QAnon the Black Dawn of the Nazis, right? Which is another entire fantastical compilation of folk myths and folk objects and moments in history that they put together and they presented as actually not a monomyth. They presented it as a multimyth, right? I mean, it was nothing. There was nothing simple in that entire mythology, right? So yeah, I think that the question about gaming and violence and power, and I think that Anne Kearney here has an operative word, which is gain, right? I mean, she talks about violence, gain, and power, right? So I would very much like to hear the answer to that question.
About the gaming specifically, because
about gaming in specific, because it's who doesn't play online games anymore?
Right, I mean, but again, we can't call games, like one thing, just like we can't call literature one thing. So there are books that we would never want to put in front of our children, and there are books that we would want to put in front of our children. I just put a link in the chat to a gorgeous little role-playing game called Rakuin, which is basically the story of a child who is hospitalized and can't leave the hospital. So, a child who is going to live the rest of their life in a hospital, but is using imagination and the relationships with the mother and other people in there in order to escape. And you play the game entering into this puzzle fantasy world where the child gets more and more power and agency through the power of their imagination. This is a gorgeous game. It is a little frightening. It has its frightening aspects, but it's certainly not violent, and it's certainly not encouraging just unloading clips of ammunition, through a machine gun or anything like that. It's exactly the opposite. And, for every instance of a game that you want to show me that has, some violence, the way that, an R-rated movie might have violence, I can show you an instance of a game that is absolutely splendid in its subtleties and the ways in which it is exploring the human condition through the rhetoric of its mechanics. And so what I want to offer you is the idea that games are as various as any other art form and have, the ability to express, like any other art form, the absolute basis of what we're capable of being as humans and the absolute most splendid things that we're able to be as humans. And, even very popular games, we might not say, well, what about the AAA games? Well, the Mario games that come out are AAA games, and those are absolutely charming games and extremely well executed. If you want to call the Zelda games violent, well, it's no more violent than anything that you're going to catch on a Saturday morning in the cartoon series. So, I think we still have a kind of knee-jerk idea that games are violent that is simply not representative of the genre in its entirety of games. Right. Certainly there are things I would ask people to stay, keep their kids away from for a while, but certainly not everything.
But the other aspect of it is that the idea that games are about gain and about power is also not true. I mean, I'm not a gamer, but my two youngest children, who are now adults, have been gamers their entire lives, and they've just because of their psychological, spiritual constitution or whatever, they've just always stayed away from games like that, and have always played games that are about exploring worlds or creating worlds, or working together with teams to accomplish some kind of mission that it, results in like beneficial things for the world that they've been building. And there's so many examples of that. And like Carlos was saying, it's a very, very simplistic way of looking at gaming, at an entire industry, and to paint it with just this broad brush of violence and capitalist gain, because obviously some of the most popular titles are, but also some of the most popular movies are, and some of the most popular books are, and because there are just a lot of people that enjoy that kind of stuff. That it does not mean that people who make movies or write books or create games are somehow, co-participants in that sort of nonsense. They're just clearly, trends in all media that can be seen as negative, and that's that's true of music. It's true of everything.
I think it's true of fantasy. To bring it back to our conversation, I think it's about gatekeepers. It's about kind of hegemonic or centralized narratives, and right, what gets pushed to the front, what stories get heard louder. The reason that I initially was really hopeful about bringing together some colleagues who were also, working in academia, writing fantasy, is because I had come across this article that Carlos put in the chat from Slate, which was thinking about the Oxford Fantasists, right? These folks who were Oxford dons and who wrote children's fantasy, and who, unlike me, never seemed to feel like, they had to put them aside as something separate that they did. And I found the article fascinating because the author being interviewed talks about the Oxford Fantasists engaging in recreating an empire of the mind. And this is the quote that I pulled from it. At the moment that the British Empire is waning, right? Think about when Tolkien and Lewis are writing. At the moment that the British Empire is waning, you see this rise of children's fantasy literature, which is set in these kinds of pre-colonial worlds, but also imagining these new vistas for exploration and the pleasures of exploration and colonization, encounters with indigenous people, but cloaked in a different story where the people you're encountering are magical creatures. So you're free of political resonances in an age of decolonization. But the books are supposedly for children, and this scrubs them clean of the complexities of adult concerns and gives them some kind of innocence. It becomes a free kind of space of play. And here, this is a different play than Carlos's play, right? This is the play of like reimagining the pleasures of colonization. But there's also a reinscribing of colonialist actions and privileges. Part of the pleasure of Hogwarts, of Oxford, of Harvard, have to do with profound privilege, layers of servants and workers and people who can't get in that are making your experiences so very special. It's capturing and repackaging the elitism of the British Empire, creating other landscapes to enjoy it that don't have the same vexed associations. So upon reading this article, I thought, well, that's not the tradition I want to be a part of, despite the fact that, yes, as a young person, I read a lot of Tolkien. How do we do that differently? Like, who's out there doing that differently, and who wants to join me in leading this revolt against that? Yeah. I want to do it differently. I was like, no. Where are the, academics of color writing fantasy who are doing exactly the opposite of that? Right, who are expanding our notions of humanity, who are decolonizing our imaginations, who are giving children places to exercise their radical imaginations towards justice, right, and freedom, not towards injustice. So that's how we came to this.
Yeah, I want to jump in. This wonderful friend of mine, a linguist from Oaxaca named Yasnaya Aguilar. She's from the Ajuk community there, the indigenous community. She talks a lot about futurism, and one of the things that she says, because I was just thinking about this, you were talking about the waning of the empire, as the Spanish invaded what's now Mexico, and were tearing down communities that existed at the time. She says, imagine 500 years ago, our ancestors faced with what was happening all around them, and the smallpox epidemic, and just like death on a scale they'd never seen before, and destruction. For them to imagine that 500 years in the future, this community, she's talking about her own indigenous community, this community would still exist, and we would still be speaking the same language and telling the same stories in a completely different world, and with, you know, different technology at our disposal, whatever, that helps us to keep the stories alive. That's futurism. That is, you know, this dream of keeping something essential alive, even as the world expands and your horizons grow. But like, you know, keeping that, like that I was telling you about, that mekato, that thread, that lineage spreading into the future. And she says, so what I want to do as an indigenous person who's writing, you know, fantasy and science fiction and so forth, is to see myself as part of that same tradition. And in the same way that it was tough for my ancestors to imagine what would happen 500 years later in a positive way, I want to dream of a positive future for my people 500 years from now. And I just think that's something that we can do, rather than thinking about the ways that we're going to go out and, you know, conquer the, you know, space and take over planets and terraform them and blah, 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 blah. None of those things necessarily horrible, but just thinking about how, as our universe expands that way, as humanity's scope spreads, how we can continue to be who we are, like this essential, you know, ethnic or cultural essence of ourselves that has been sustained, and that gives us, that anchors us in things that matter, so that we don't lose sight of where we've come from and just buy into like the kind of superficial, homogenous, you know, go USA or whatever it happens to be. But we see ourselves as part of a tradition that stretches far into the past, and then has a responsibility as it moves forward into the future to not abandon certain things that are valuable, but to integrate them into the new places that we move into. And so, yeah, that's something that the Oxford School did not do, and that I think is super important in the work that I produce, at the very least.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just to pick up on that, I love this idea of lineage that you tie back to, David, because what lineage does is it brings your own past and your own validity up into the present moment, and then you're thinking about using that as a guide toward making more future possible. And I think the other thing that is complement to that, that I really think about a lot in my fiction, is expanding the present, you know, basically. So, you know, we think about future fiction moving us this way, but I like to also go this way. And, you know, this idea of if we sort of like think of a future that isn't so much about, you know, launching ourselves, you know, as something called a human being onto a planet X that we are terraforming, but more like a humanity that is just more varied and more intricately understood and more granularly complicated in the way that we imagine, so that our stereotypes become more and more useless to us. You know, that basically these huge types that we have made of people fall away. They deliquesce when we have achieved that. Then I think what becomes more possible is a future where we are better able at conceptualizing what a future could be, because we are letting false notions fall away. And I think fiction is glorious at that. Fiction has a glorious power for helping those simplistic, invariant memories, to use the language of AI creation. Let those invariant memories fall away and become much richer and almost fractal. You know, I think one of the things that I've used as a metaphor to talk about race is this idea of, you know, if I call myself a Cuban American, I'm not helping you very much, because the inside of the little square of Cuban American is an infinite variety of what that could possibly mean. And the more fractal we think of race, the more useful it is for us, you know, so that, you know, we were constantly holding off on judgment, holding off on assumption, and listening to people rather than jumping to a conclusion.
Okay, so you didn't like Plato at all. So let me just actually
going to suggest Walida Imarisha, who I just put in the chat, Walida and Marisha, who comes up with this beautiful term visionary fiction, I'm going to suggest her as our Plato substitute for
I have no investment in Plato whatsoever, and I just want to say that
And yet,
no, I don't. There's no yet. I don't. I just want to say in parentheses that Karl Popper actually was the one who called Plato proto-fascist, right? I mean, it's a long tradition in thinking about Plato through those lines. No, but since you didn't like Plato, let me just ask about someone else that you will not like, especially in reference to children, and that is Freud. So what do we do with violence, the violence of children, and the ways in which children need, first of all, to channel, right, to bring out the violence that's inside of them. And I really don't believe that children don't have violence in them. Right, so how do they bring it out, and how do these narratives, these fantasist narratives, how can they help children to manage and negotiate and resist, but also transcend the violence that is, I would say, something that is very basic in human psyche.
I guess one of the things I would initially want to think about is a careful definition of what you mean by violence, because to me, there is like a self-defense mechanism and a self-preservation thing that we don't want to totally annihilate in people, and that we want, this idea of self-preservation to be a good thing. So that, for instance, if an adult somehow attacks a child, that a child resists, so, there are ways in which I don't always think that, what we might cast in a broad spectrum of violence, we want to completely eliminate. But if you're talking about a kind of like viciousness or a kind of proto-sociopathy or something like that, where there's a dehumanizing element and a joy in that dehumanization in some way, if that's kind of what you mean, which I'm not sure about, I guess what I would say is that fiction is an empathy machine. Like fiction literally is a machine for empathy, and that what you do when you are encountering a text is that you are inventing empathy inside of yourself through the characters and through the stories that you are saying. So all fiction does that, and the kinds of empathy they create might not be good, and depending on what kinds of stories are being told. But because we are so linguistically tied to the way in which we imagine our world. And, when I say imagine a world, I'm not talking about the life of the mind. I'm talking about our eyesight processes stimulus and the way that we touch. And I'm talking about the way in which we create our idea of the world. I'm not sure if there's anything quite so penetrative as storytelling to help people imagine the kinds of empathies that we want. And so then it becomes the responsibility of a culture, a la what David was talking about, to tell the stories that are going to create the kinds of people that we want. The culture will protect you, and so, yeah, it's like the violence question is tricky. And I think we need to be very, careful about like what we mean by that. But once we are being careful, I would offer the idea that if there is a better tool for evoking empathy than fiction, we should use it right away, because I don't think I've found it, at least not in my life.
I agree with you. And I also think it's important to recognize that there are multiple, even when we're talking about physical violence, like action from one person to another person that can cause bodily harm, there are multiple types of it, multiple reasons for it. And the type of violence that is like reprehensible and that we need to weed out is the violence of people in positions of power against people that they hold power over. That kind of, that oppressiveness that is also usually accompanied by the gleeful joy that Carlos was hinting at. Like there's a pleasure to quash inferior beings under your boot, right? But then there are two other types of violence that I depict in my stories. I will admit that I have fight scenes out the wazoo in my books. And many of them are people on people. It's not just people against monsters or gods or whatever, it's people on people. Because there are two times when I think that violence in a world like the one we live in, that has, you know, cultures of power oppressing communities of color usually, are when you're pushing back against the violence that's being, you know, used against you, and when you're defending other people who are being, you know, affected by that kind of violence. And I think that children are usually like kind of innately hungry for justice. And so when they hear about something unjust, they want to be, you know, little boys wanting to be superheroes and protecting people. There's like just this, you know, base level desire to protect the weak in people. And I think that is a noble impulse. And that, yes, sometimes it takes the form of some little kid balling up her fist and saying, "I want to punch the bully." But I don't think that reprimanding that kid and saying, "No, violence is never the answer," is the right way, because we don't live in a world where you can say violence is never the answer. And I know that there are people, and like lots of progressive people, who do not want to hear that, but that is the truth. It's an untenable position to say that violence is never the answer. There are moments where you will, if you live in a community of color, if you know, I grew up in Section 8 housing, in, you know, surrounded by gang violence and prostitution and drug abuse. And there were times that I had to resort to violence to survive. And you know, I'm not going to look back at that and feel guilty because of what I did. I was just obligated to do it. Violence to protect myself, violence to protect other people. Nobody was seriously hurt, but like, you know, punching a guy a couple of times so that he sees that you're not a pendejo, as we say in Spanish, is sometimes the only way to survive. And that's also, you know, people who are always like bringing up statistics about violence among young men of color without examining the structures that oppress them and keep every other avenue of solidarity and you know, and communal protection away from them, so that they have no choice but to band together and push back against the institutions that want to erase them and their identity and their language and so forth, are just so simplistic and horrifying to me. There's a reason that those young men are the way that they are. I mean, I grew up around gang members, who many of whom were my friends, and I understand what it means to like have no choice but to be in a gang, because there's nothing else that you can cling to, nothing else that will protect you. And so, yeah, like, it's a very simplistic view of the world to say we should just like weed violence out of children's literature and games and so forth, and everything will be okay. No, it won't be okay, because then those children will have violence exercised against them, and they will have no protection at all. They will not know how to defend themselves.
And I would just extend that discussion. You know, we're talking about children because that's the way Neni framed the question, was about children and violence. But because Force of Fire is literally inspired by the Indian Revolution, where the question of violence versus nonviolence is a really interesting one. It's similar when we have conversations about the civil rights movement in this country, and the way that kind of mainstream narratives, what's a nice way to say this, forget most of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. actually said, and frame him in certain palatable ways that only reinscribe kind of mainstream power, is not dissimilar from the way that folks who didn't follow ahimsa, you know, folks who weren't Gandhian, folks who did believe in Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who was a Bengali revolutionary, who no one internationally talks about, and yet was just as important in the Indian Revolution, said, you know, give me blood and I will give you freedom. Blood will give you freedom. And in Force of Fire, I have characters actually having conversations about violence versus nonviolence and like what, and they're struggling with it as young people. They're saying, you know, these serpents, who are my stand-ins for the British Empire, are doing violent things to young children. They're magically ripping out their voices, right? They're taking away their ability to speak. And what are we, as the slightly older children, to do with this? Are we, like, how are we to deal with this injustice? And I think this speaks to both of you kind of commented on, we're middle grade writers. We're writing for, let's say, 8 to 12-year-olds or 8 and up, 8 to 80-year-olds. But certainly the 8 to 12-year-old readers, they have a deep sense of what's right and what's wrong, and doing the right thing to protect not just themselves, but folks who are more vulnerable than them. And that's what these characters in this book have out and out discussions about. Like, do we follow the path of nonviolence because that's somehow better than what our oppressors are using against us? Like, we cannot use the tool of our oppressors. You know, and I you know, stick a little, Audre Lorde in there, you know, master's tools cannot break down the master's house. Do we go that way? Or do we say, well, actually something really terrible is happening right now, and violence is something that is justified in order to, you know, do the right thing, in order to rescue these vulnerable others. I think it's something that you can have your characters struggling with. But I think that all of what David and Carlos said about what avenues are available to those who are oppressed by central powers, right, is an important question to ask ourselves in children's literature, as in everywhere.
I also just want to quickly chime in and say, in the Sal and Gabby books, the violence is all like trickery and perhaps psychological warfare. Like, Sal begins in Break the Universe by sticking raw poultry in a bully's locker to, you know, basically dodge, you know, the fight that happens, and all of the violence gets resolved by that. But it also brings up the threat, and that's where the discussion happens. And that, to me, is one of the things that makes the discussion much more pertinent to kids, because they're like, well, I can't pull a chicken out of a different universe and stick it in somebody's locker. What do I do instead? And it's all the other play that happens, all the other conversation, and the mercy that Sal shows the bully later that opens up a different conversation for a different kind of narrative. See, that's where I think that's the mechanic of how empathy is born in books, where you have this outrageous but extremely interesting premise of, yeah, what if I could just jam, you know, a dead chicken in some kid's locker? And then from there, it's like, oh, Sal doesn't repay the bully by getting him kicked out of school like he could have, but instead ask the principal, you know, to basically show him mercy. And all of a sudden the discussion changes in a very interesting kind of way. So, you know, I think one of the things that literature can do is it can invite us to entertain possibilities without forcing us to come to an answer right in that second. A judge has to make a verdict. A reader doesn't. And holding two different ideas in your head and letting them struggle is one of the great gifts of literature.
David?
Yeah, no, I don't have anything else to add to this, to that particular question.
All right, so we have exactly 9 minutes left and 2 questions. The one question comes again from Ankani, who says, how much of the writing that you do comes from listening to children's fantasy? That's the one question. And the other question is on the topic of games again. And it comes from Mega Jiao, who says, who's asking, says that she wants to hear about games as a specific medium for presenting fantasy narratives. And this, of course, goes back to an earlier comment that was made that said that what games do, the games that children play, the online games, are narratives to them. So the specific medium for presenting fantasy narratives, particularly in regard to interactive engagement, immersion, world building, learning about other cultures, perspectives, and similarities. And Megan has also shared a few games here links a few games that might be relevant. So narrative games, online games, fantasy narratives, and the fantasy narratives as presenting other perspectives, experiences, etc., cultural. So how much do you listen to children, and how much do you present to them other cultural perspectives and experiences? I suspect that the question means not of your own. So not you, Sayantani, as an Indian, not you, David, as Mexican American, not you, Carlos, as Cuban American.
I'm not sure if Anne is talking about cultural stereotypes or from listening to I'm not sure what the them is, if it's stereotypes or not. I mean, the one thing that we haven't talked about, and I can ask David and Carlos because I'm interested, I've talked to, other writers for young people about this, is do we create our worlds in ways that we would like to see them? So for instance, I was talking to someone lately who was describing being a trans author, but resisting putting transphobia in their books, despite kind of an editor saying, but no, don't you want, and they were saying, no, I don't want to put suffering on display. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm actually going to write a story where transphobia isn't a thing, and move forward like that. And I've been conscious in the Kiranmala books, where there are basically no non-brown people, let's be honest, really, except for a few brief moments in New Jersey. But I've been really conscious about like how to portray and on the whole, to portray a world where xenophobia and racism aren't a thing, but are metaphorized. So for instance, the childhood racism that I felt was disrupting my life, was violently entering my life, becomes, this monstrous Rakhosh, who bursts into my character's kitchen and disrupts her life and forces her to begin this adventure. But even though my Rakhosh was racism, in the book, there's no ostensible racism, right? There's a non-binary character who says their pronouns and everybody just calls them by their pronouns, and that's the end of the story. Like, we just move on. And that's just the rules of that multiverse. We just, that's it. We respect people and we move on. We call them what they want to be called. We treat them with respect, and that's it. Are those choices that you all thought about and made purposefully in one direction or the other?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm always thinking about to what extent I want to depict real world racism. I mean, when I'm writing fantasy, because I obviously also write realistic fiction. So when I'm writing fantasy, I'm usually just trying pretty quickly to get my heroes into situations where they're dealing with the fantasy or science fiction elements or whatever. And so I also delight in just unless there's a reason to be heavy-handed about something, and to just like depict children from diverse backgrounds just being children from diverse backgrounds without having to grapple with, because there's a need for that. There's a need for joy. I mean, in like you said earlier when you were talking about trying to sell your book, just that desire to that hunger for trauma porn from writers from communities of color is just kind of gross to me, and so I stay away from it. But I mean, but this idea of like listening to multiple children, we all do school visits. We're always around other children. We're always listening to their questions and their concerns. When I'm writing a story, I don't sit there going, let me kind of like just spend some time around kids and like, and try to get ideas from them. I'm going to write the story that I'm a writer. I'm compelled to write certain stories. They emerge from places within me that are sometimes opaque, and I'm not exactly, sure about where they're coming from. But as I'm writing them, I'm thinking about the children that I interact with and the kinds of things that they've told me that they want, and the things that I've learned from listening to their questions and interacting with them. And that's reflected in my work as well. But a lot of times also it's the work of other writers that I respect who are writing about particular communities, whose voices kind of like impinge on my consciousness and influence me. It is, I think, important to constantly, as a writer, for young people to be open to children's voices and open to just in general voices from a multiplicity of communities, because we're trying to depict, a world in which that plurality is normal. We want to normalize it. None of us wants to write. I don't just, like, if I'm writing about the Rio Grande Valley where I live, I can't just write about Mexican Americans because we're not the only people living here. There are, I have many Korean American friends who live down here, many Filipino people who live down here. There are Dominicans and there are some Cubans as well. I mean, it's a diverse place. And while Mexican Americans make up, more than 70% of the population, a book set here is going to have to bring in those other, especially if I'm really, if the things that I say about representation are true and the need for it. If I'm going to preach literary dignity, I need to have literary dignity in my work as well.
Yeah, I want to just jump in and say, the medical community, as far as my research as of 2017, was unsure why the Latinx community was the fastest growing community for both type 2 and type 1 diabetes in the United States. As soon as I read that, I decided Salvidon was going to be a type 1 diabetic. And I made that decision extremely consciously as part of awareness building. And since we're talking about the medical humanities, I also wanted to make sure that the type 1 diabetic kids out there were not being depicted in stereotypical ways anymore. And so Sal is athletic and active and full of all sorts of energy that is never attributed to diabetic kids, who are, talk about a kind of, sort of like a kind of, medical porn or whatever, where you're just putting the disease on display and they're nothing but disease and whatever. And so to me, creating an intersectional suite of characters, and the other thing that I wanted to pick up on, and I think both of you have mentioned it in different ways, but, we use the allegorical, I think, more than other sorts of literature. I think, allegory can be seen as very heavy-handed, but in middle grade, I think it's much more of a currency. And so maybe racism is locked inside of a character, or maybe in my case, I put, my wisest character, my most breathtakingly intelligent and wise and kind character is a sentient toilet, because I know the kids will listen to the toilet. The kids will listen to the toilet. The toilet speaks truth. They will believe that like that. And so, ta-da, here's where I can be as didactic as I want to be, because toilet.
Gotta have to too.
So what I was saying is, like, allegory has an extreme power in these kinds of situations to be extremely useful to couch these kinds of conversations. And I use allegory all the time. And I think a lot of middle grade writers who write from non-hegemonic perspectives also use allegory as a kind of easy medium to make points.
We have one last question, and it will be very quick. And okay, I will read them. Right now we have 3, but I want just stealth quick responses from each one of you, and then we will wrap up. So Yanis Ziligakis has sent actually 2 questions, and they can be combined. What age can we expose children to other narratives, and is it not difficult? Is it not a mistake to actually put upon children secondary trauma, so the trauma of the adults? And as he says, often secondary trauma is even worse than primary survivor trauma. And I think that we can all understand what he's saying. And then the last question is, what are the dangers of disenfranchised children learning that it's okay to use violence to protect themselves from violent systemic structures, and then using violence on other disenfranchised populations? Right? So this is something that we know very well. Every new migrant group who comes to the United States starts oppressing the group that is already at the bottom. How does children's literature teach children of this particular age group about the ethical use of violence? And this is really the last, and then we will wrap it up. But quickly.
Want us to answer that quickly?
Yeah, those are really fun questions to answer quickly.
Okay, so I'll model quick answer. It's never too early to expose children to the narratives of others, whatever. I mean, if it means what I think it means. Secondly, it is true that we should not impose on children the traumas of adults, but the traumas of adults are shared by children. I got a lot of pushback from the book, The Chupacabras of the Rio Grande, that I co-wrote with Adam Gidwitz, because it depicts the border wall and on the border, and in the debate in the community and stuff like that. And there are a lot of white parents who got really, really upset that we were talking politics in the book because their children were too young and not ready to discuss that. But the children that live on the border don't have a goddamn choice in the matter. So to me, it's never too early to talk about the trauma that children are experiencing to children because they're fucking experiencing it. Apologies. And and finally, the question that about disenfranchised, having children who are disenfranchised learn not to enact violence on those other people. We've been talking about this whole time. It's about telling stories about a pluralistic world, showing students being respectful and caring of people like them and people who are not like them, and just making sure that children have those books in their hands.
Just to pick up on this quickly, first of all, excellent short models, David. I'll give you, an honorary degree from CUNY for those. So excellent work. I would add to that and say, we need to be, again, very, very careful about the vocabulary that we're using, because of course, secondary trauma thrust upon children that's a problem, but it's a very leading kind of question, because then we have to ask, well, how is that actually done? Is that done in careful literature that, is depicting the problem, but not necessarily trying to, impose, but instead open up to discuss problems that children often don't get to discuss. And remember that one of the things that children are very, very smart, but they often don't have the means by which to articulate, so all of, that temperament and intelligence that's already there may not have the means by which to actually, expound on feelings and other things like that, but it can be recognized and it can be useful. And so giving language to children is one of the most valuable things that we can do for children. What we have to be careful of course, is not doing that carelessly, because that can also be traumatizing. But how do we do that? That is the work. That is literally the job, and it is difficult every time and different every time you go to write a different book.
Sayantani?
And I just add that I think that the sorts of stories that we're trying to write, I think all three of us and are writing, if they fit into that notion of visionary fiction, I think that what they are is they're creating spaces for our readers themselves to practice how to deal with the things that they are dealing with in their real lives. But these stories give them room to try on different possibilities that then they can take with them into their real lives. And so hopefully if we're doing our jobs right, we're centering our readers, and we're making a lot of room, as Carlos said before, like we're not giving binary answers, we're making kind of multiplicitous, nuanced possibilities for them to try on in a safe and ethical way, and then take it into the rest of their lives, hopefully.
That's a good answer.
I think that safety is a very good place to stop. Sometimes it's even a very good place to be. And and thank you very, very, very much to Sayantani Dasgupta, to David Bose, to Carlos Hernandez, to Arden, who is somewhere here, to Sarah, who is also somewhere here, to all of you who joined us. And I think that what's on the chat might actually be available. So if you want to email me or email ICLS, we can make the chats available to you, I think. I say knowing nothing about technology. All right. So thank you everyone for coming to the launch of the Medical Humanities major at Columbia University. I bid you farewell. Go off.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you everybody so much. It was so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah,
That was That was full of joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.